Hello YouTubers, I hope you're all doing very well this day. Today we're going to talk about Latin America from 1945 until the present. We're going to focus kind of on major themes and issues in Latin America and some particular vocabulary, and we're going to kind of bounce around Latin American countries. Remember, when we speak of Latin America, we're talking about basically everything from Mexico down to the southern tip of South America. The Latin part of Latin America coming from the idea that most of the languages spoken in Latin America are Latin-based, as opposed to the more Anglo world of North America, which is more based on the English-speaking part of America. So Latin America is, in the most recent time period, has emerged as an industrializing and developing part of the world. When we speak of Latin American countries and development in Latin American countries, we often hear the word third world countries. So it's a good time to kind of go through that definition of what third world means. Third world countries basically means countries that lack development or industrialization. So third world countries also not only have to do with economic development, but also have to do with governmental development. And so in the ideal, the kind of like the first world countries, which the United States would be a part of and most of Western Europe, these would be places that are highly industrialized in their economy, very productive economies based on manufacturing and high level of sophistication and diversity in economic life, but also giving a great deal of political freedoms and rights to the people in the country, and basically a fully democratic system of government which allows the people to have as much freedoms as they possibly can. So a third world country is lacking in some of those areas, usually lacking in social programs, in services for the poor or the needy, in healthcare, a government that is either authoritarian or dictatorial, and usually doesn't have an extremely productive economy, or has an economy that's kind of funneled toward one specific thing. So when we speak of Latin America, certainly not all of Latin America is third world country, but we talk about parts of the world in Latin America that are approaching third world status because of their lack of development in some areas. So some of the major themes from Latin America at this time are this fact that they are developing and democratizing and becoming more equitable and reaching a level of social justice and democratization and development, economic development, that is on par with the rest of the developed world. So we're going to go from a few places and talk about some of these political problems and issues, and we'll start with Mexico. So Mexico, after going through the Mexican Revolution, kind of the civil war that divided Mexico and brought forth this new Mexican Constitution in 1917, Mexico had been ruled basically by the same political party that had won every election since I think it was 1910, and so this was the party of the institutionalized revolution, or the revolutionary institutionalized parties, the PRI. The PRI had been in power for 70 years, and the PRI, because this was supposed to be a multi-party democracy and only one party was winning power, a lot of people started looking at the idea that it was corrupt, that they were more interested in just maintaining their power base and were not interested in social reforms and helping the people of Mexico. And so when the PRI signed into NAFTA, which was the North American Free Trade Agreement, a lot of people were super fed up because they felt like the PRI was allowing too much foreign intervention. They weren't promoting social change for the people. And so this is when this Zapatista movement arose. So the Zapatista movement arose in the south of Mexico, in the Chiapas region, where there was extreme poverty and a high indigenous population. And these Zapatistas were kind of labeled by the government and by the United States as terrorist-like organization because they were armed rebels, and they usually wore masks, and so they were somewhat frightening looking in the media. But really what they were asking for was social change and reform to help the poor. The people who they felt were the foundation of Mexico and the foundation of the Mexican economy. And so their voices were heard because of their radical action that they took. They weren't attempting to overthrow the government. They were simply attempting to gain more understanding for their cause. So the Zapatistas were definitely crucial in modern Mexico in gaining more, at least attention for the plight of the poor and the idea of the social inequalities that exist in Mexico. So in 2000, Mexico elected its first non-PRI politician in Vicente Fox. So Vicente Fox is important in Mexico because he was the first non-PRI member who won the presidency in Mexico. This is a big deal because it represented a shift in the power, and ever since Vicente Fox was elected, the elections have been much more diverse. Multiple parties are actually gaining votes, even though the PRI is back in power as of 2012. They're paying more attention to the plight of the everyday Mexican, and so Mexico has come a long way. It's still too soon to tell how closer to democratization they're becoming, but they're definitely entering into a higher degree of development. All right, other parts of Latin America were facing heavy foreign intervention as well, so much so that the United States was mostly serving during this Cold War time period to protect their investments in Latin America and to guarantee that none of these places became communist. So the United States was only intervening and becoming a presence, and militarily becoming a presence in Latin America if their investments were threatened, or if it looked as though a country was becoming communist. So one of the prime cases for this was in Guatemala. Guatemala was a banana growing country with heavy native population, native Mayan population, indigenous populations who were very poor. And so in the 1950s, when they democratically elected a president who was promising to reform the government to make it more serving of the poor and to raise the standard of living for the poor, they Jacobo Arbenz, the president, said, I want to reform land and take away some land from these landed aristocracy and from the foreign companies. The most important of these foreign companies for the United States was the United Fruit Company. The United Fruit Company was a banana growing operation that heavily invested in Guatemala. So when the United Fruit Company got wind that Arbenz was going to be taking away their land, they appealed to the U.S. government. They painted Arbenz as a communist because he was redistributing land and taking away this from the United States company. So the United States got involved, sent in the CIA, and organized a rebellion in order to topple Arbenz, and they installed a U.S.-friendly dictator, basically. So the United States, this became a big theme of the United States. Anywhere where their interests were being threatened, they would send in or help by installing somebody who would allow the United States to still operate in Latin America. The one place that this was not the case was in Cuba. So Cuba represents a stark contrast to most of the rest of Latin America. In Cuba, Fulgencio Batista had been friendly to the U.S. for years. He was essentially running a dictatorship in Cuba, allowing heavy U.S. foreign investment, and having kind of not responsive to the people of Cuba's needs. So, as a result, Fidel Castro, who was a Cuban lawyer, got together with Che Guevara, who was a Argentinian doctor who had turned socialist and communist freedom fighter for the people of Latin America, and they staged a an overthrow of Fulgencio Batista. They were welcomed by the people of Cuba, who saw them as helping the everyday person. And so Fidel Castro was installed as the new leader of Cuba. Fidel Castro was significant because he brought a socialistic, basically a communist regime to Cuba, which was aimed at taking away power from the elites, removing the United States, completely severing ties with the United States as far as foreign investment goes, and really ticking off the United States. And Che Guevara had helped him do this because Che Guevara was very good at was committed to stopping U.S. imperialism, and by using guerrilla warfare tactics to do so. So Che Guevara would become significant and a hero to many Latin Americans because of his views and his stance. And Fidel Castro, who continues to rule Cuba, kept Cuba communist and completely cut ties with the United States. It led to a series of diplomatic crises with the United States and Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion, where the U.S. tried to assassinate Fidel Castro, which failed. The Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Russians were bringing missiles onto Cuba to fire at the U.S. if possible or necessary, which freaked out the United States. And basically, the United States is still has a severed relationship with Cuba, and we don't know where that's moving in the future. So this idea of resistance to the Americans is pretty strong. It dates back to pre-World War II times. One of the local heroes, in addition to Che Guevara, is Augusto Sandino, who was a Nicaraguan who devoted himself to fighting against the United States intervention in Nicaragua. Was seen as a hero in Nicaragua and throughout Latin America. Was killed and wasn't able to see his mission of getting the United States out, because the United States installed or helped install a dictator in Nicaragua who wasn't toppled until the late 1970s, early 1980s, by a party in Nicaragua which was democratically elected and took their name, the Sandinistas, to kind of hearken the name of Augusto Sandino, who's this hero in Latin America. So all of this to say, basically, that Latin America has gone through a lot of political upheaval where military dictatorships have been kind of the norm and have been allowed to operate as long as they're not communist and as long as they allow heavy U.S. intervention. And so the only thing that really gets the United States' attention is if a leader decides to move liberally to promote social welfare for the people, and therefore gets labeled as a communist, which was not okay for the American people. Now, since the fall of the Soviet Union and kind of the relaxed, the ease from the United States on communism, there's been a move toward democratization, and the United States has been attempting to help out with this move, although there's still heavy interest in Latin America from United States companies, which have led to the term banana republics. Banana republics were basically the name given to countries that had a puppet regime who answered to U.S. companies, and essentially banana companies, and were not really responding to the people's needs. So this term banana republics actually has a pretty negative connotation, which is surprising because it was chosen because it sounded cool by the name, as a name for Gap's high-end clothing line, if you can call it high-end clothing line, I guess. I haven't been into a banana republic in a long time. So, all right, so that's some of the major themes from Latin America. That covers quite a bit of the vocabulary, at least that I assigned to my class. If you have other questions or concerns or things you'd like me to talk about Latin America, please put it in the comments. Otherwise, be awesome and have an awesome time. AP test is coming up. I hope you're ready. So you can do it. Be awesome.